Welcome to the Watch Floor. I'm Sarah Adams. This is where we break down global events, emerging threats, and geopolitical shifts. We prioritize what you need to know, why it matters, and we leave all the noise out of it. Before we get started, here's what you need to know today. Somaliland is being treated like a sideshow when it isn't. Recognizing the state of Somaliland isn't about symbolism, it's about access, leverage, and control. What happens in Somaliland is going to affect international politics. It's going to impact Chinese and Gulf state trade and commerce. It's going to potentially cause concerns with the terrorist safe havens operating in the Horn of Africa. So let's talk about what actually is happening, right? What's really going on in Somalia? Let's just first roll a clip.
And Mr. Netanyahu, President of Israel, became the first country to recognize us. Thank you very much, Mr. Netanyahu. Thank you very much. I am waiting 35 years now. That's this recognition. And I am thanking to our President, Mr. Abdurrahman Ira, to recognize our country. I am saying, thank you, Mr. Netanyahu. Thank you very much.
This story doesn't begin with Israel. It doesn't begin with geopolitics, shipping lanes, or even this diplomatic recognition that's all the buzz this last week. It actually begins with mass graves, flattened cities, and a population that learned through firsthand experience that waiting on the international community to intervene would be fatal. You know, for more than 3 decades, Somaliland has existed in this really strange diplomatic limbo. It governs itself, it secures its own borders, it holds its own elections, it fights against terrorism, and it maintains internal stability in a region that's known for chaos. Yet it's being treated like it doesn't even exist, largely because it forces our policymakers to be confronted with a very interesting question, right? Success doesn't seem to always come when there's international intervention. Somaliland didn't get it, right? But the failure next door, Somalia, got plenty of it, and they have needed endless and constant support. And so this is something we really have to spend some time talking about, and we will today. When Israel recognized Somaliland, they didn't create some new state.
I want you to know that I'm signing now, as we speak, Israel's official recognition of Somaliland and its right of self-determination. Our friendship is seminal and historic.
It was a political reality since 1991, and it was really a decision that everybody's been kind of just pushing to the back burner and not really dealing with. And it's so much more than symbolism. It's kind of the fact that for all these years, we've really ignored this rare success story, in a region where we're, like I said, funding kind of this failure next door. And I really want to talk a little bit about Somaliland and Somalia, so it's a little clearer to you. To understand why Somaliland exists, there's 2 key pieces I want you to understand. First off, the country of Somalia never legally completed the process to basically form a union with Somaliland, and we'll explain that to you. The second is the Somali state basically carried out massacres against its own citizens in the north, and I want to talk to you about that because that is why Somaliland exists. It didn't have some ambitious goals to go do its own thing. It needed to protect its people, right? They were being massacred. So let's just go back and briefly talk about 1960. So at that time, Somaliland got a small bit of independence. For the 75 years prior, they're a British protectorate. And what that means is they kind of controlled their internal politics and dynamics. And then the British government did things like kind of like global security, treaties, those type of things for Somaliland. So when that ended, there was kind of an interest to combine Somaliland, which I told you kind of had like British control, and Somalia, which was really acting like an Italian protectorate. And it was like, let's put them together and form this union. So from 1960 to 1999, it was never ratified to bring these two kind of protectorates together into a nation. It was discussed, but there was no constitutional amendment. There was no kind of vote on it, et cetera. So it's a really interesting thing people don't talk about. Back in maybe like 2005, the African Union did a whole study and actually went back and looked at all the paperwork and said, yeah, this really was never ratified. It is not legal for Somalia to say they own or control or have some sort of rights over Somaliland. But even then, the African Union kind of wimped out and they didn't really give them any kind of recognition. They still kind of view Somaliland through kind of the leadership of Somalia, right? So even though they said that, they didn't really help to correct the situation in any way. So they were basically kind of operating this entire time as separate legal entities. And now what really happened then is there was multiple things. First off, I want to talk to you again about those massacres. So from about 1987 to 1989, there was kind of this military dictator running Somalia. His name is Said Barre, okay? He started systematic campaigns of violence against the northern populations in Somalia, and he targeted like the two major population centers there. And at the time, the majority of people were the Ishaq clan, okay? So that clan now is basically the population of Somalia. So he starts bombing them. He hits the two major cities. He pretty much wipes out Hargeisa at the time. And the numbers are pretty staggering. So conservative estimates say he killed about 50 to 100,000. But when you talk to kind of locals and investigators who've really put time into this, they said, no, the number is about 200,000. In addition to that, 400 to 500,000 people had to completely flee Somalia, right? Because it was now no longer safe to live where they were from, where they grew up, you know, where their parents raised them. And so a lot of them ended up going into Ethiopia. So this was also one of the largest kind of mass migrations in North African history ever. And it's very ironic that we now have this situation where Israel goes and declares recognition. Somalia pushes the United Nations to kind of hold this event to say, hey, is this allowed? Is this legal? The UN came back and really said, it is legal. You aren't technically or legally a unit of Somalia. And then it was interesting, Tammy Bruce from the United States kind of came out and said, yeah, it's okay if Israel chooses who to negotiate with, do business with, recognize.
Israel has the same right to conduct diplomatic relations as any other sovereign state. Earlier this year, several countries, including members of this council, made the unilateral decision to recognize a non-existent Palestinian state. And yet, no emergency meeting was called.
She didn't go as far as to say the United States would recognize Somaliland, but, you know, we've had close relationships with the nation. They have done a lot of the things we've asked of them, and we'll talk about some of their successes today. And then they've done a really great job of doing counterterrorism operations with us. You know, as terrorists have really taken hold in Somalia. And I've spent some time talking about this, right? We have over 50% of the country of Somalia is controlled by al-Shabaab, which is al-Qaeda's affiliate. And then about 5 to 8% is controlled by ISIS. So the state of Somalia doesn't even control the majority of its own country, right? It doesn't even have a 50% ownership in its country. There's so many other crazy things when you look at some of the numbers, like al-Shabaab brings in more money than the entire country of Somalia. They have a higher GDP. They pay like their mid-level commanders what would be equivalent to $60,000 a year in US dollars, right? That's in a third world country. So it's also not just the fact that this terrorist group has so much control, like they're thriving. They're $1 billion enterprise, and they really run the country in very large pieces of the country like the mafia would do, right? They collect taxes, they have courts, they set up a lot of like tolls and stuff that you have to pay. That's on top of the Somali government already being involved in so much corruption. I mean, even when I go back and talk about the UN, so the Somali representative to the UN, amazingly, is now going to be the head of the United Nations Security Council, which is crazy. So Somalia is going to lead the United Nations Security Council when there's a very high percentage chance al-Qaeda will take their country in the year 2026. But they have a seat to tell the rest of us, this is what's best for your national security. That's really ironic. The other thing is their rep to the UN, he's a dual US citizen. Now, a lot of people don't understand how this works. So this corruption doesn't matter if it's Somalia, in all these locations. When we give these billions of dollars to these countries, it gets pilfered out in so many ways. So one that's very, very famous in Somalia is we send money, and the African Union pays a lot, the United Nations pays a lot, to like fund and arm and train their military kind of to do this terrorism fight that they're really failing at. So what they'll do is they'll say, hey, we need funds to pay. Let's say it's this detachment of troops. There's 20,000 of them. Please fund it. And so they'll get the funding from the international community, and that unit didn't have 20,000 troops. They had 5,000. So what happens with all the money to pay the 15,000 troops? It gets stolen by these corrupt politicians, and a lot of it leaves the country, and it goes places like the Emirates, right? There's a lot of money laundering, unfortunately, as counterterrorism, humanitarian dollars go in. Such large percentages come out. So there's a lot of schemes like this. Another one is the elites took in a lot of this money and benefited themselves. And then what they did with it is they basically took control of the institutions. So like if it was the United States, it would be like, okay, now they're in control of the State Department and you can't like vote them out, or they're in control of the Department of War and you can't vote them out, right? Because all this money that came to them made them powerful and corrupt. And then the irony is, because everybody's, of course, thinking Somali fraud, we all know it now, it's happening here. Well, their representative to the UN, the ones who's a dual citizen, literally has a child care center in Ohio. So he's not only a part of fraud and corruption in his own country, right? He's likely committing the same acts here. So it's just this very, very frustrating thing to watch kind of Somalia continue to misuse US taxpayer dollars. But then next door, Somaliland has really done a great job of building their own nation. And we haven't recognized them yet. I want to talk a little bit about those things that went right, okay? First off, when this military dictator Barre was killing all these people, I know people have the question in their mind, well, the U.S. didn't intervene, it didn't get involved, it was a genocide. Well, unfortunately, our government was still in that like Cold War mentality then. And unfortunately with Barre, there was this belief then, hey, it's the devil we know, right? Let's stick with him. We know him. We have access to him. He's it'll be reliable how he deals with things. And yes, these Ishaq people were killed, but that's an acceptable loss. I mean, I know that's a horrible way to say it, but that's how they were viewing it, in the early 90s, right after all of this went down. Another thing is, even present day, the U.S. is almost like an absolutionist when it comes to a country's borders, right? So our government says those are solid borders unless an institution, like the United Nations or whomever, redraws these borders. We are viewing a country's borders as they are, right? That's just our policy. And then so they view the country of Somalia all as one and all in control. And they don't technically view Somaliland as separate, even though, of course, there are a lot of people within the U.S. government pushing for this recognition. But I just want you to understand like a little bit of the thinking. Now, in 1991, after all this occurred, these massacres and everything, Somalia collapsed, okay? So that was really the point then. Somaliland said, hey, we never joined as a union. You can't get your stuff together, right? We are going to govern ourselves. And remember, they didn't secede from Somalia. They had never legally joined. So that's the time Somaliland declared independence. And they really started kind of withdrawing from the chaos that was happening in Somalia. And they said, hey, we have to find a path forward. How is it going to be? And the path forward they chose was kind of like self-determination, self-reliance, while Somalia chose the path forward of like relying on the international community to come and bail it out. So I want to explain how these two things work, okay? So if you're relying on the international community to bail you out, that means you're getting IMF loans, World Bank loans, you get UN peacekeeping troops, etc. Obviously, U.S. counterterrorism dollars and funding. All these pockets of money come in to help sustain your government. And then that comes, as you can imagine, with a lot of strings tied. Lots of times, for example, these Western governments and authorities have a very strong control over like how you form your government, how you write a constitution, how you put your parliament together. We saw a lot of this happen after 9/11 when we went into Afghanistan. The international community pushed really hard to have some of this control. Of course, when Libya kicked off, they really didn't get the control they wanted, but they wanted to kind of repeat the same type of thing. So that's what it looks like when there's international intervention that come in, save the day. And then, of course, there's downsides to that, right? You have now donors. All these countries are giving you money. You have to appease the donors in some way. And there's so much corruption in that. You really are almost giving up some of your sovereignty. I mean, think about it. In Somalia, when they choose a leader, it's kind of through clans. But when they're making the agreements and the deals, it's like foreign soldiers standing around them. It's this very interesting situation. Now, when we talk about Somaliland, they never asked for kind of international support or recognition. So that's a little more complicated, right? They didn't have a bunch of money flowing in to throw at these problems. They had to do things the hard way, but they did it very smartly in a number of ways. One I want to talk about because I think it's super important. So they decided to kind of have this ruling body, which was these council of elders, okay? This is extremely important. So Somaliland is a Muslim majority country. Well, the one thing you worry about when you're kind of a fragile state is, of course, Islamists, Muslim Brotherhood, terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda back then, and other historic groups, in the 90s coming in, influencing your population and taking their own control of the situation, right? Because terrorists get the best benefits from weak states. Even after Israel declared Somaliland's recognition, Al-Shabaab, of course, immediately started making threats against Somaliland and Israel because they need a weak state. That's why they thrive and survive in Somalia, right? They understand this principle. So anyway, what they did is, so they have this council of elders. Now, what a lot of people do when they make the mistake is they start building a government more based kind of on religious authority. And that's when these outside actors, especially Muslim Brotherhood, swoop in. They provide religious scholars. It could be from Egypt, Yemen, Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is very forward-leaning in this, right? That's why we see all these like madrasas in South Asia. Saudi Arabia saw the opportunity, came in. The governments didn't have a lot of money at the time to fund education. Like, we'll give you money to pay for schools. They just have to be these Islamist madrasas and da-da-da-da-da. So it's a very interesting way kind of the Islamists move in. Well, it's also then how you bring the ideology in, right? It's a lot different in societies that have a kind of a religious undertone to listen to and believe the person who's interpreting their holy book, right? Of course, in this case, this is the Quran, and they can really manipulate it the way they want, if they're given enough power and influence. I mean, the Grand Mufti in Libya right now is a member of Al-Qaeda, and he's not just some religious authority in the country. He makes decisions on the oil industry, on trade, on commerce, on real political issues. It's actually a scary thing to think about. So anyway, Somaliland nipped this in the butt right away, and it's like, no, we have these councils of elders. They love and respect their nation. We believe they'll do right by the people. So then over time, they were able to put their own constitution together, to create their own currency, to create their own police and security forces. And so over time, they really made their own legitimacy. And as you can imagine, they're really only answering to the people in the community because there's none of this outside money and outside donors coming in. So if you don't deliver for your people, you're not going to stay in charge. So they've done a really good job of keeping a stable government. They also have done a good job of kind of peaceful transitions of power. Now, not everything in Somaliland's been perfect. Some processes have gone slow. There have been a lot of complaints that they had maybe too much control of the media, those type of things. So I'm not calling this a perfect situation. But what I'm telling you is there's been a lot of success, right? They run their own government, secure their borders. I told you they push back on extremism. They kept the Muslim Brotherhood out, which is a huge success, especially, when you're really just building your governments and they offer you so many different type of things, right? It's super important. They also made sure they dealt with like tribal and clan rivalries and they brought them to the table. They negotiated through problems instead of using force and violence and coercion, right? And they made the society that was able to govern itself. It had courts, tax system, and all the enforcement mechanisms you would expect. So now we're kind of at this point, and a lot of people are kind of questioning Somaliland's existence. But I really think the question needs to be, hey, if for almost 35 years this country could take care of themselves just on their own, they were able to govern, they kept terrorists out, we have a good relationship with them, like, what do you actually have to do for the international community to like give you recognition or to reward you in some way? Because we spend so much time rewarding like failed states, and Somaliland isn't the only country who really needed recognition, right? We had Eritrea, South Sudan, etc. In those cases, it was really interesting. They like massively failed. And then the international community had to come in and be the saviors. Well, with Somaliland, they never asked for any saviors. So they also don't owe a bunch of people a bunch of things, which is a really interesting thing. So I thought I would explain it to you today so you understood it and you understood kind of like, this is a long time coming, this recognition. I really think we're going to see a lot more, assuming like the United Arab Emirates are probably going to be the next to recognize. They think of things very pragmatically. Somaliland is in a key hub, right, for international shipping and trade. And then, of course, leaders from Somaliland were just meeting with the U.S. government, and I think there's getting to at least be discussions of maybe more formalized agreements with them as a government. Now, as you can imagine, Somalia isn't happy at all.
Mr. President, taking note of the statements made by some officials regarding the forced involuntary relocation of Palestinians from their homeland to other countries, A3+ unequivocally reject any steps aimed at advancing this objective, including any attempt by Israel to relocate the Palestinian population from Gaza to northwestern region of Somalia. This action is not only unlawful, but is morally reprehensible. Recalling the provisional measures and advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice regarding the forcible displacement of Palestinian people from their land, we call on Israel to comply with its legal obligations on this matter.
And besides the whole outburst and whatnot at the UN talking about genocide and not taking any responsibility for actually committing genocide, we've seen some crazy things coming out of that country. We've seen mock executions of Jews. We've heard politicians in that country, some just resigned, but we've had some say, oh, you should be imprisoned if you support Somaliland. Some say you should be put to death if you support Somaliland. And then they're really using the levers at their disposal. As I told you, the international community, including the UN and the African Union, views Somalia as kind of in control of the whole region. So if you want to go to Somaliland, you have to get a visa from Somalia to travel there. So now Somalia is like, well, that's fine. We're just not going to issue visas for Somaliland and we'll cut you off, right? No one will be able to travel there to visit, to invest, right? We'll cut off business and trade. You know, it's very ironic to watch kind of this mafia-style control that they're trying to implement. And it's also ironic because if you just saw about 2 months ago, Somalia's whole e-visa system got compromised. But it wasn't just that hackers got it. The government had to kind of say after the fact, oh yeah, it also fell in the hands of Al-Shabaab. So a terrorist group got control of the entire database. Now, when you think of who could be in that database, for example, I served in the CIA. So people who worked in my organization and served in Somalia, they're in that database. You know, we obviously had military back in the day. They're in that database, right? So they can have access to biometrics of Americans. It's a very concerning thing. And we did see hackers putting out foreigners from the database and being like, why was this person in Somalia? Why was that person in Somalia? So it's a really interesting thing, and it's very ironic to just watch how Somalia is trying to manhandle the situation. So I really appreciate you being here on the watch floor, and I hope at least a discussion about this situation is helpful, and we're going to go forward and talk more like this. If there are more developments when it comes to Somaliland, we'll talk about it, especially if some of these terrorists try to make good on their threats. And, I appreciate you being here, and have a great rest of the week. Thank you.